Picture this. It's 1742, and you're a young crow warrior named Running Eagle. You've been tracking a wounded elk for 3 straight days through territory that belongs to your enemies, the Blackfoot. Now, I want you to understand something about the kind of cold we're talking about here. When historians say it was 40 degrees below zero, they're not talking about the kind of cold that makes you grab a heavier coat. This is the kind of cold that kills you. The kind of cold where your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, where exposed skin dies in minutes, where even the most experienced winter hunters start making fatal mistakes because the cold literally slows down your brain. Running Eagle should have turned back days ago. Any reasonable person would have. But here's the thing about hunger in the 18th century. Plains. It wasn't like skipping lunch. When your band was facing starvation, when children were crying from empty bellies, a wounded elk represented the difference between life and death for dozens of people. So Running Eagle pressed on, following blood drops that froze solid before they hit the ground. And then, on that 3rd day, something impossible happened. Running Eagle saw green grass. Not just any green grass, fresh, living green grass poking up through 3 feet of snow. Now, if you've ever lived through a real winter, you know this is like seeing a ghost. It simply doesn't happen. Plants don't grow in 40 below weather. Snow doesn't melt when there's no heat source. But there it was, a small circle of impossibility in the frozen wasteland. The grass surrounded a small earthen mound, and as Running Eagle approached, he could see that this wasn't just some random hill. This was a structure, a dwelling. And here's where the story gets truly extraordinary. When Running Eagle pushed through the entrance flap, he stepped into what felt like a summer evening. Let me pause here because I need you to understand the magnitude of what just happened. Running Eagle had gone from an environment cold enough to kill him in minutes to a space that was warm as a pleasant summer night. No fire was burning. No smoke was rising. This wasn't some mystical occurrence. This was engineering so sophisticated that it would take modern science centuries to fully understand it. Inside, lying on buffalo robes, was an ancient Hidatsa man named Watching Owl. He was dying, and he was alone, and he was the last keeper of knowledge that stretched back 1,000 years. Think about that timeline for a moment. 1,000 years. We're talking about engineering knowledge that had been passed down through generations since before the Crusades, before the Norman Conquest, before most of the cathedrals of Europe were even dreamed of. Watching Owl had been waiting. Not for rescue. He was beyond that. He had been waiting for someone worthy to receive the knowledge that would die with him if it wasn't passed on. And through some combination of fate, desperation, and sheer determination, Running Eagle had stumbled into becoming that person. For 3 days and 3 nights, as blizzards raged outside that impossible warm lodge, Watching Owl taught Running Eagle secrets that his ancestors had spent centuries perfecting. The old man's people had learned to read the earth itself, to identify the spots where warm air rose naturally from deep underground. They had discovered that the earth was alive in ways that most people never imagined, breathing warmth through hidden channels and thermal vents. But this wasn't just about finding warm spots. The construction knowledge was incredibly precise. 4 hands deep for the foundation pit, walls angled at exactly the right degree to catch the winter sun, and most crucially, the ability to identify what Watching Owl called the Earth's breathing spots. These were locations where geothermal energy naturally emerged, creating microclimates that could sustain life in the harshest conditions. The lodge itself used what we would now call thermal mass principles, though Running Eagle learned them as the Earth's memory of summer. The walls absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it at night. The positioning captured every available bit of solar energy. The internal structure created natural convection currents that circulated warm air without any mechanical systems. And here's the strategic implications that Watching Owl revealed. His people had once controlled the finest winter territories because their lodges needed 70% less firewood than conventional dwellings. 70%! That meant they could support much larger populations in areas where other tribes simply couldn't survive. They could hunt when others were huddled around fires trying not to freeze. They could craft tools and weapons while their enemies were focused entirely on basic survival. This wasn't just technology. This was a military advantage so profound that it had shaped the balance of power across the entire northern plains for generations. As Watching Owl's breathing grew weaker, he pressed a sacred bundle into Running Eagle's hands. Inside were the measuring cords marked with precise knots, sacred earth paints for marking thermal channels, and most importantly, the songs that had to be sung during construction. Because this knowledge wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. The ancestors understood that working with the Earth's natural energy required respect, ceremony, and precise ritual. When Watching Owl finally died, Running Eagle faced a journey that would become legend. He had to carry this revolutionary knowledge back to his people through one of the worst blizzards in living memory. Every step was a battle against cold that wanted to kill him. Every mile was a race against time, because if he died, the knowledge died with him. But Running Eagle made it home. And what happened next would transform not just his band, but the entire political landscape of the northern plains. Because he wasn't just carrying the secret of staying warm, he was carrying the power to revolutionize survival itself. When Running Eagle returned to his band with claims that he could build a dwelling that stayed warm with almost no fire, he might as well have announced he could make the sun rise in the west. The reaction wasn't just skepticism. It was the kind of deep, visceral disbelief that comes when someone challenges everything you think you know about how the world works. Chief Broken Arrow called for an emergency gathering of the tribal council in the main lodge. And let me tell you, this was not a comfortable meeting. Picture 20 seasoned warriors and elders sitting in a space so cold that their breath formed clouds, burning through precious firewood just to keep from freezing, while this young warrior claimed he had knowledge that would make all their suffering unnecessary. The first voice raised in opposition came from Grey Wolf, the band's most experienced lodge builder. He had been constructing winter shelters for 30 years, and the idea that some dying stranger could possess techniques unknown to his people struck him as either fantasy or dangerous medicine. If such knowledge existed, Grey Wolf argued, why would our ancestors not have possessed it? Are we to believe they chose to suffer when comfort was possible? But the medicine woman Singing Crane saw something different in Running Eagle's eyes. She had the gift of reading truth in a person's spirit, and what she saw there wasn't the wild excitement of delusion, but the deep, careful reverence of someone who had received sacred knowledge. Still, she couldn't simply accept such extraordinary claims without testing them. For 4 days, Singing Crane put Running Eagle through ceremonies that would have broken a lesser man. She made him fast while recounting every detail of his encounter with Watching Owl. She burned sacred sage and watched how the smoke behaved around him, looking for signs of spiritual contamination. She consulted the bones and the sacred bundles, seeking guidance from the ancestors about whether this knowledge was clean or gained through dark means. On the 4th night, as Running Eagle completed his final purification ritual, Singing Crane announced her verdict. The knowledge was genuine, and it was sacred. The spirits had guided Running Eagle to Watching Owl for a reason. The band would attempt to build this impossible lodge. But here's where the engineering challenges began, and they were staggering. Running Eagle had learned from Watching Owl that construction couldn't begin just anywhere, at any time. According to the ancient knowledge, he had to wait for the full moon, because moonlight revealed the subtle steam wisps that marked thermal vents. On clear, cold nights, these wisps were visible as tiny columns of vapor rising from the earth, but only to eyes that knew how to look. The site selection took 3 weeks. Running Eagle walked the area around their winter camp every night, studying the ground for signs that most people would never notice. A patch where snow melted slightly faster, a spot where the frost formed different patterns, a place where certain cold-resistant plants grew just a little taller. These were the Earth's breathing spots, the locations where geothermal energy naturally emerged. When Running Eagle finally identified the perfect location, the construction process revealed itself as something far more complex than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just building a shelter. This was creating a living system that would work with the Earth's natural energy. The foundation required a specific mixture that took days to prepare correctly. Clay had to be gathered from a particular type of riverbank where it had been naturally processed by water flow. Limestone had to be crushed to exact specifications, not powder, but pieces small enough to pack tightly yet large enough to create thermal channels. And the sacred red ochre, which Running Eagle learned wasn't just ceremonial but actually conducted earth warmth while blocking cold penetration. The women of the band took responsibility for weaving the willow frameworks, but these weren't simple basket-like structures. Watching Owl had taught Running Eagle that the framework patterns created specific convection currents. The weave had to be tight enough to hold insulation but loose enough to allow air movement. The angles had to guide warm air upward while drawing cold air down and out through hidden channels. Children gathered the insulation materials, but again, not just any dried grass would work. Different grasses had different thermal properties. Some retained heat, others actually conducted cold. The gathering became a lesson in botany, as Running Eagle taught the children to identify the right plants, the right time of year for harvesting, even the right way to dry them to maximize their insulating properties. But the most critical element was the smoke hole design, and this is where the ancient engineering reached levels that would impress modern architects. This wasn't simply an opening in the roof. It was a carefully engineered chimney system that created negative pressure to draw cold air out while pulling warm earth air up through those hidden channels in the walls. As construction progressed, the band attracted unwanted attention. Enemy scouts from the Assiniboine tribe had been watching from distant hills, and they were reporting back about the strange building techniques. Word was spreading that the Crow were attempting something unprecedented, and that knowledge was dangerous. Other tribes would want this technology, and they might be willing to fight for it. The timeline became critical when Running Eagle's wife, Moondancer, went into labor during a fierce blizzard. The lodge was only half complete, but the temperature had already dropped to 50 below zero. This was the kind of cold that killed healthy adults, let alone women in childbirth. The race to finish became desperate. Warriors who should have been resting worked through the night by the light of fires that threatened to freeze their hands. The wind was so fierce that it knocked men off their feet. Snow accumulated faster than they could clear it away. But they kept working because they understood that Moondancer's life and her unborn child's life hung in the balance. As dawn broke on that terrible morning, something miraculous had happened. The lodge interior was maintaining a steady 65 degrees, with only a small ceremonial fire burning. When Moondancer gave birth to a healthy son in that impossible warmth, while other lodges in the camp fought desperately against the cold, everyone understood that the world had just changed. Chief Broken Arrow himself measured the temperature difference, moving between his own lodge and the new thermal lodge with growing amazement. The thermal lodge was 30 degrees warmer while using 1/4 the wood. 1/4. Within 5 winters, the thermal lodge technology had accomplished something that massive armies and decades of warfare had failed to achieve. It had completely redrawn the political map of the Northern Plains, and I want you to understand the scale of what we're talking about here. This wasn't just a minor advantage, like having slightly better weapons or faster horses. This was a technological revolution that changed the fundamental rules of survival. Tribes that possessed thermal lodge knowledge could suddenly winter in territories that had been uninhabitable for generations. They could support populations 50% larger than their rivals while using the same resources. Think about what that means in military terms. If your enemy can field 50% more warriors because they can keep 50% more people alive through winter, you're not just at a disadvantage, you're facing potential extinction. Running Eagle, now known throughout the region as Earth Lodge Keeper, understood the explosive potential of what he possessed. This knowledge couldn't be shared carelessly, but it also couldn't be hoarded selfishly. The solution he developed was both brilliant and dangerous. He established a secret society with elaborate initiation rituals that would control who learned the techniques and under what circumstances. The initiation process took an entire year. Potential apprentices had to prove not just their technical ability, but their spiritual worthiness and absolute discretion. They learned construction techniques, yes, but they also learned the sacred obligations that came with the knowledge. Because here's the thing that made this system work. The elders taught that lodges built without proper ceremony would lose their thermal properties. Now, you might think this was just superstition, but it was actually ingenious social engineering. By linking the technology to spiritual requirements, the society ensured that knowledge couldn't be stolen through simple observation or forced extraction. You had to be properly initiated, properly trained, and properly committed to the spiritual framework, or the techniques simply wouldn't work for you. The demand for this knowledge was staggering. The Mandan tribe offered 20 horses, for the construction secrets. To put that in perspective, 20 horses represented wealth equivalent to multiple luxury cars today. It was an offer that could have made Running Eagle's entire band wealthy beyond their dreams. But the council made a crucial decision. They would share the knowledge only through marriage alliances, creating a web of thermal lodge wisdom that bound tribes together through family connections. This wasn't just about controlling technology. It was about building political networks that could reshape the entire region. And reshape it they did. The technology evolved rapidly as different groups added their own innovations. The Arikara developed underground tunnel systems that connected multiple lodges, creating whole villages that shared warmth. Picture an entire settlement where you could walk from lodge to lodge, underground, never exposing yourself to the brutal winter cold. These weren't just individual buildings anymore. They were integrated heating systems for entire communities. The Pawnee made a discovery that would have impressed modern materials scientists. They found that adding certain crushed minerals to the wall mixture increased heat retention by 20%. 20%. They had essentially discovered thermal additives through centuries of careful experimentation. But with great power comes great danger, and the thermal lodge technology made these villages incredibly valuable targets. Raiding parties began specifically targeting thermal lodge communities, trying to capture builders alive. The knowledge was worth more than horses, more than weapons, more than traditional loot. Living builders could be forced to reveal secrets, or they could be kept as slaves to construct thermal lodges for their captors. The most dramatic test of thermal lodge technology came in 1751, and it reads like something out of a medieval siege chronicle. A coalition of Sioux bands, probably numbering in the hundreds, attacked a Hidatsa thermal lodge village during the depths of winter. Now, conventional military wisdom said that winter sieges were impossible. The attackers would freeze before the defenders starved. But the Sioux had a different plan. They believed they could outlast the thermal lodge village by using overwhelming numbers and rotating their forces. Fresh warriors would replace those too frozen to continue fighting, while the defenders would eventually run out of food and be forced to surrender. It didn't work out that way. The siege lasted 40 days. 40 days. The defenders, warm and comfortable in their thermal lodges, remained combat-ready while the attackers struggled against cold so severe that many suffered frostbite and exposure injuries. The Sioux had to maintain huge fires just to keep their forces alive, which consumed enormous amounts of firewood and created smoke columns visible for miles. When the siege finally broke, it wasn't because the thermal lodge village surrendered. It was because the Sioux coalition couldn't sustain the losses from cold-related casualties. They had learned the hard lesson that thermal lodge technology wasn't just about comfort, it was about military superiority. This victory established thermal lodge knowledge as the ultimate strategic asset on the northern plains. Trading networks emerged around the specialized materials needed for construction. Certain clays from specific riverbanks became as valuable as gold. Rare insulating grasses were traded across hundreds of miles, and those precious measuring cords, marked with sacred knots that encoded construction specifications, became objects of incredible value and careful protection. Running Eagle's son, Young Elk, proved that innovation never stops. He figured out how to reverse the airflow channels, creating lodges that stayed 20 degrees cooler than outside temperatures during blazing summers. Suddenly, thermal lodge technology wasn't just about winter survival. It was about year-round climate control, using nothing but careful engineering and natural earth energy. By 1760, when French traders were drawing their maps of the region, they marked villages of the warm earth as major power centers. These weren't just settlements anymore. They were the capitals of a new kind of civilization, one that had learned to work with natural energy systems in ways that wouldn't be understood by European science for another 2 centuries. But here's the thing about possessing revolutionary technology in a world where survival depends on adaptation. Everyone wants it, and someone always wants to destroy it. The thermal lodge tradition was about to face its greatest threat, and it wouldn't come from rival tribes or harsh winters. It would come from a force that viewed indigenous knowledge not as wisdom to be preserved, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. The thermal lodge tradition faced its greatest threat, not from the brutal winters that had claimed countless lives, not from enemy raids or territorial wars, but from something far more systematic and devastating: the United States government's deliberate campaign to destroy indigenous knowledge. In 1887, Indian agents at Fort Berthold received explicit orders to eliminate what they called impediments to civilization. Thermal lodges, with their sophisticated engineering and deep spiritual connections to the land, represented everything the government wanted to erase. These weren't just buildings to be demolished. They were symbols of indigenous wisdom that contradicted the narrative that native peoples were primitive and needed to be civilized. The destruction was methodical and brutal. Government agents would arrive at villages with sledgehammers and crowbars, systematically destroying thermal lodges while forcing families into government-built housing that was poorly insulated, inadequately heated, and designed to create dependence on government supplies. It was cultural genocide disguised as improvement. Running Eagle's grandson, James Earth Lodge, was imprisoned for the crime of teaching construction methods at the newly established government school. Think about that for a moment. A man was put in jail for sharing knowledge that could keep people warm and save lives. The charge was promoting savage practices and interfering with the civilization process. But here's where the story becomes one of extraordinary courage and determination. Because while the government could destroy buildings and imprison teachers, they couldn't destroy the knowledge itself if people were willing to risk everything to preserve it. Sarah Earth Lodge, James's daughter, developed a system so ingenious that it would have impressed any resistance movement in history. She memorized the sacred measurements by encoding them in traditional quillwork patterns. To anyone watching, she was simply teaching her daughters decorative art. In reality, she was transmitting the precise specifications for thermal lodge construction through seemingly innocent geometric designs. The beadwork contained the angles for wall construction. The quillwork patterns encoded the measurements for foundation depth. Even the colors had meaning. Red indicated thermal channel locations, blue marked cold airflow patterns, yellow showed solar positioning requirements. An entire engineering manual was hidden in both plain sight as women's craftwork. The lowest point came in 1920, when Indian agents conducted what they called a final survey of savage knowledge retention. They found only 4 people who still knew the complete thermal lodge construction process. 4 people, out of thousands who had once possessed this wisdom. The systematic campaign of cultural destruction had reduced the keepers to just 4 individuals. One of those 4 was Mary Earth Lodge, who worked as a washerwoman at a mission school. Every day, she cleaned the sheets and clothing of people who viewed her as a primitive savage who needed to be educated out of her backwards ways. But Mary had memorized not just the construction techniques, but the sacred songs that had to be sung during building. And she had a plan. Working in the laundry room, Mary began teaching her nephew Thomas the sacred measurements, while pretending to show him how to fold sheets properly. 4 hands deep, she would whisper while demonstrating a particular fold. Angle of the winter sun, while showing him how to crease a pillowcase. To anyone watching, it looked like basic domestic training. In reality, it was the preservation of 1,000 years of engineering knowledge. Thomas Earth Lodge grew up carrying this secret knowledge through decades, when being caught practicing indigenous traditions could result in imprisonment or worse. He worked as a ranch hand, as a carpenter, as anything that would allow him to survive while keeping the thermal lodge wisdom alive in his memory. The revival began in 1973, during a period when indigenous rights movements were finally gaining momentum. Thomas Earth Lodge, now an elder in his 70s, met a young man named Robert Flying Crow at a powwow in Montana. Robert was a Crow physicist who had earned his doctorate from MIT, and he was researching traditional technologies for his dissertation. When Thomas quietly mentioned that he knew how to build lodges that stayed warm without external heating, Robert initially assumed he was talking about conventional insulation techniques. But as Thomas began describing the precise measurements, the thermal channel systems, and the convection principles, Robert realized he was hearing about engineering that matched cutting-edge passive solar design. Together, they began the scientific analysis that would prove the thermal lodges achieved R values of 30, a measure of insulation effectiveness that exceeded most modern building standards. The thermal mass principles, the convection channels, the site selection methods, everything matched what contemporary architects were just beginning to understand about energy-efficient design. In 1991, the first traditional thermal lodge, built in 70 years, rose on the Fort Peck Reservation. The construction drew elders from multiple tribes, many of whom wept openly as they heard the sacred songs sung again after decades of silence. The temperature data was staggering. The lodge maintained comfortable temperatures through a Montana winter using 90% less energy than conventional buildings. 90%. Think about what that means in our current climate crisis. We're spending billions of dollars trying to develop energy-efficient building technologies, while indigenous peoples had perfected these techniques centuries ago. Today, the Thermal Lodge Institute trains architects and builders from around the world. Climate scientists study these thousand-year-old techniques as models for carbon-neutral architecture. Universities that once dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive superstition now send their best engineering students to learn from tribal elders. In 2019, Running Eagle's great-great-great-grandson Michael Earthlodge received a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, for his work adapting thermal lodge principles to modern urban housing. The irony is profound. The same government that once imprisoned his ancestors for possessing this knowledge now celebrates their descendant for sharing it. But perhaps the most moving moment in this entire saga came in 2021, when 12 tribes gathered for the first intertribal thermal lodge, raising in over a century. As elders sang the construction songs that had been preserved through generations of persecution, young people learned that their ancestors had solved problems the modern world was just beginning to understand. The thermal lodge stands as proof that indigenous knowledge isn't historical artifact, but living wisdom essential for humanity's future. In our desperate search for sustainable technologies, for ways to live in harmony with natural systems rather than dominating them, the answers have been waiting in the wisdom of peoples we once tried to destroy. Running Eagle tracked a wounded elk through enemy territory and stumbled upon knowledge that could transform the world. Today, as we face our own climate crisis, we're finally beginning to understand that indigenous peoples weren't primitive. They were the first environmental engineers, the first sustainable architects, the first to understand that human survival depends on working with natural systems rather than against them. The circle is complete, but the knowledge continues to grow.